Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are on video 6 and we are talking about theories and consequences of migration. So, here are your objectives. So, after watching this video, you should be able to explain patterns of migration using these migration theories we're going to talk about, and analyze the economic and social consequences of migration for areas that generate and receive migrants. So, like always, you should take a second to set up your notes to reflect the outline that I have here for you. The first thing that we're going to discuss are a couple of different theories of migration. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is obstacles and opportunities. So last video we discussed things like push and pull factors, right? But migration is not always that simple. People aren't that simple. Migrants often encounter intervening opportunities and intervening obstacles, which kind of affects how quickly or they migrate. So some intervening obstacles, these things are barriers that make reaching their desired destination more difficult, right? So think about a really basic barrier could just be distance, right? However, there are other barriers such as a lack of money, a lack of papers, a travel visa, documentation, or passports. Some other examples could be things like immigration quotas that could limit a migrant's movement into a specific country. Some physical barriers, obviously, are things like oceans, deserts, and mountains. They're hard to pass for humans. And weather that wouldn't permit crossing. So think if a blizzard happens or if there are floods. Lastly, language barriers can be an intervening obstacle as well. And so you can kind of see here, there are some other examples for you. But there are also intervening opportunities, and these are just the opposite. These are positive opportunities that arise, and that's going to temporarily halt or permanently settle a migrant before they reach their intended destination. And so this is things like along their journeys, maybe they met someone and fell in love and they want to settle where that person lives. Or maybe they obtained a job along their route and they decide that they want to stay there and work that job. So just keep in mind that there are obstacles and opportunities that present themselves during the migration process. It's not just the push and pull factors that affect migrants. Chain migration is this really simple idea that people migrate to specific locations because their relatives or members of the same nationality previously migrated there. So it's like a link, it's like a chain, right? Everyone's linked. And some examples of that are like in over the Rhine here in Cincinnati. German migrants first moved there, and then their families followed soon after. And some other examples are like we see ethnic enclaves like Chinatowns. And an ethnic enclave is just a geographic area that has a really high concentration of cultural identity. And so ethnic enclaves are kind of results of this chain migration. These people come together because they feel comfortable living together, and it kind of mimics their home cultures. Okay, Zelensky's migration transition model is pretty easy to understand. It's based off of the DTM, like a lot of things are. And he argued that changes happen in migration patterns due to social, economic, and demographic circumstances. And really the easiest way to put that is migration changes based on the status of a country in the DTM. Okay, so if you look at this top chart here, countries in stage 2 of the DTM, which are typically poor or overpopulated, they have a lot of out migration, right? Immigration to those more developed countries. So we see the most international migration in countries that are in stage 2 of the DTM. It's kind of the main idea here. The most international immigration is happening in countries that are in stage 2 of the DTM. But if we look at stage 3 and stage 4, these are comprised of mostly internal migrants, right? So we might see people moving from rural to urban areas. We might see people moving from cities to suburbs. It really just depends. But the moral of the story is that these developed countries here see a lot more internal migration, where we see a lot more international migration in stage 2 countries. All right, Ravenstein is huge in migration. And so if there's anything that you focus on when we're talking about theories, it's remembering these laws. And I think that a lot of them are intuitive, so you'll understand them and be able to realize that they make a lot of sense. So Ravenstein is he did his work in the 1880s, and he kind of observed migration patterns and came up with some laws or kind of just general guidelines. Of course, today there are always exceptions, but he really forms the basis for most migration theories. So the first kind of law that he proposed is that migrants travel shorter distances. Okay, so remember the idea of distance decay, right? The further apart two places are from each other, the less likely it is that people will migrate between those two places, right? People move closer, and that's just because it's easier and their perceptions are more realistic here. And so when we think about the types of migration, right? Remember earlier we learned that internal migrants are much, much more common than international migrants, right? And so that helps us kind of remember this law, or as a result of this law here. The second one is that migrants that do travel long distances, they end up settling in urban areas. And this is a phenomena that we're seeing kind of all over the globe, is that there are more people living in urban areas now than ever before. And think about it, if you're going a very, very long distance, you're probably more familiar with those huge urban areas that a country is known for. And there's also going to be more opportunities there for you, right? There's more jobs. Okay, so step migration, you want to kind of highlight the step migration here because it's a big concept, but Ravenstein talked about it, okay? And so what this really means is that migrants travel in a series of steps, right? Think back to the first slide about obstacles and opportunities. We don't see people moving in one big swoop, right? It's a process where migrants reach their eventual destinations through a series of smaller moves. And so if you think about it like an example of like a rural to urban movement, right? You start off in a really small town, and then you move to a larger town, and then you move to a small city, right? Which is bigger than your larger town, but it's still not as big as maybe a mega city, right? And so we see migrants moving in these steps rather than all at once. It's not common for someone to come from a very, very small town with 300 people and move straight to New York City. So keep that in mind, that step migration is kind of a big idea here. And then kind of going off of step migration, he argued that most migration throughout history has been from rural areas to urban areas, right? And so that is actually still the case today. Okay, number 5. Counter migrations, right? He argues that each migration flow produces a counter migration, right? And so sometimes those are return migrations, right? When immigrants are moving back to their former homes. However, it's kind of just an in and out theory. As people move in, other people move out. And number 6 is the primary reason for migration is economic. We've talked about this before. You can see here on this chart that supports that the majority of people migrate because they want better economic opportunities. Okay, lastly, let's talk about the types of people that are migrants. Okay, so Ravenstein argued, and this is factually true, that international migrants are oftentimes young men and they are single without families, right? And you can see in this graph that shows us that adults ages 20 to 39 really make up a lot of the immigration that we see in our country, in the United States. And that's true all around. So think about it, it makes sense. Elderly people often don't migrate internationally, right? Because they have a hard time getting around as it is, let alone moving to another country. And women are more likely to move within a country, right? You don't typically see people dragging their families across country borders. Okay, done with Ravenstein, and this is the last theory we're going to talk about, is the gravity model of migration. So this idea combines this concept of distance decay, right, and kind of also combines Ravenstein's idea that the belief that there is a greater pull to larger urban areas for migrants, right? And so the gravity model assumes that more people are likely to migrate to a large community rather than a small one. But it also has to do with the distance that people are willing to travel, right? And so here is the equation for the gravity model. You would do population of city 1 times population of city 2 divided by the distance between those two cities squared. And so the higher number is going to give you the more likely migration. But again, remember, this is just based on the simple concepts that people are more likely to travel shorter distances and they're more likely to settle in large urban areas, okay? And so an example here is Cuban migration to the US, right? So we see most Cubans settle in Florida here, right? It's a very close proximity to Cuba. Cuba's located like right down here if we would have the rest of the map. So it's a close proximity and it's a large city. And so here in the red is where we would find Miami. Half of all of Cuban Americans reside in Miami. So this is kind of a case example that proves this gravity model. Okay, moving on to consequences of migration. Let's talk about economic consequences first, right? And we're going to talk about remittances. And so remittances is the transfer of money by workers to the people in the country in which they're originally from. So think about like if a migrant moves to the United States and starts working, they send money home to their families, right? And so this is an economic consequence because it's actually an increasingly important source of wealth for people in developing countries, okay? So there were over $550 billion in total remittances sent in 2013. So this is a vast amount of money, right? And you can see here that India and China are the leading destinations for remittances. So that's where people are sending most of their money. And then the US, Russia, and New Zealand are the countries in which those remittances are originating. Another economic consequence is guest workers, right? This is when migrants move to a more developed country in order to find work. This is usually for a short period of time. And the idea behind it is that it's periodic, right? Maybe it's seasonal. However, we see a lot of times migrants end up staying in that country in which they went to be a guest worker. And this is important to the economy because it provides a cheap labor source and helps the economies of those developed countries stay stable. We also see that migrants help boost our economies, right? And you can read this on your screen. Nearly 200 of the 500 largest businesses in the world were started by immigrants or their children, right? So since immigration is super difficult, we see that immigrants are oftentimes really motivated to seek out an education, work hard, and be successful. Okay, so some economic kind of disadvantages here is that migration causes a lot of economic fear, right? This idea that migrants take our jobs, right? And so this causes tension and fear among people. And then the second negative is this idea of brain drain, right? When out-migration of a country is mostly skilled and educated workers, this harms that home country by leaving a really small number of skilled, educated workers to help grow the home country's economy rather than where they're moving to. Okay, two really quick social factors. Number one, we see increased xenophobia. Like, this is the strong dislike of people who are from another culture or nationality, right? And we also see increased tension among groups. And then we also see increased diversity, too. So we see new